I look at my hands now, spotted with age and shaking with a tremor that has nothing to do with the cold, and I can still see the grease under the fingernails. It never really leaves you, that oil. It soaks into the dermal ridges, becomes part of your fingerprint. Back then in the belly of my hands were steady, or at least I told myself they were. They had to be. In the dim, jaundiced light of the engine room, they were the only things keeping the Atlantic Ocean from swallowing 40 men whole. I was tightening a fuel injection line on the starboard diesel, a task that required the kind of tactile delicacy you wouldn't expect from a man built like a dock loader. But that was my gift, if you can call it that. The metal spoke to me. It hummed. I remember the smell most of all. Memory is a liar, usually painting the past in colors too bright or shadows too dark, but the smell is honest. It was a thick physical soup of diesel fumes, unwashed bodies, stale cabbage, and the acrid, biting scent of battery acid. It coated the back of your throat. You tasted the air rather than breathed it. It was a far cry from Nantes. God, Nantes. Sometimes when the headaches come and the room starts to spin, I'm back on the factory floor at the Renault works, 3 years before the world decided to tear itself apart. That was a different kind of noise. It was a cathedral of industry. The rhythmic thumping heart of the hydraulic presses, the high-pitched singing of the lathes, the shouts of men echoing in the high rafters where pigeons roosted. There was space there. You could look up and see sunlight filtering through the dust motes in the clear-story windows. You could walk out the big sliding doors at lunch and feel the solid, unmoving earth beneath your boots, smell the Loire River, muddy and slow. Here in the iron coffin of there was no earth. There was only the steel deck plating, vibrating constantly against the soles of your feet, a reminder that we were trespassing in a world that did not want us. I was a machinist, a creature of tolerances and specifications. In Nantes, if a piston was off by a fraction of a millimeter, you scrapped it and started over. You cursed. You wiped your brow, you went home to your wife. In the submarine, if a valve failed, if a seal wept, you didn't go home. You went down. That was the fear. It wasn't the sudden flash of a torpedo or the shredding tear of shrapnel. It was the math of it, the physics. I would lie in my bunk, staring at the condensation dripping from the pipework above my face. Chinese water torture counted out in seconds, and I would calculate the hull crush depth. I knew the tensile strength of the steel. I knew the rivets. I knew that the ocean is heavy, a crushing, relentless weight that searches for weakness with the patience of a saint. I was terrified of the slow death. The lights flickering out, the hull groaning as it compressed, the water rising past your ankles, then your knees cold and black, while you waited for the air to run out or the pressure to finally snap the vessel like a dry twig. The captain didn't talk about physics. Captain Cabanier was a man carved from teak, his face a map of weather-beaten lines that never seemed to move. The briefing for Operation FX had been brief, clinical, delivered in the tiny wardroom that smelled of wet wool and gallices. We were going north. Norway, the fjords, to lay mines in the shipping lanes used by the iron ore transports. It sounded simple on paper, a line drawn on a chart, but the fjords were shallow and they were guarded. We were taking a needle into a haystack where the hay was made of ice and the farmer had a pitchfork made of depth charges. We go in quietly, Cabanier had said, his eyes scanning us, looking for cracks in the porcelain. We sow the garden and we leave before the wolf wakes up. He made it sound like a heist, but as I stood there by the diesel, wiping a rag over a pressure gauge that refused to sit still, I knew it wasn't a heist. It was a gamble. There was a mine layer, heavy and slow compared to the U-boats that hunted in packs. We were a Clydesdale trying to tiptoe through a bedroom. I watched the needle on the manifold pressure gauge. It flickered, just a twitch, an erratic jump every fourth cycle. To anyone else, it was nothing. To me, it was a scream. I reached out and tapped the glass with my knuckle, a sharp rap to settle the mechanism. It stabilized. I exhaled, a breath I didn't know I was holding. Order. I needed order. If I could keep this one gauge steady, if I could keep this one engine turning at exactly 300 revolutions per minute, then maybe the universe would hold together. I watched a single bead of sweat, or was it condensation, detach itself from a cooling pipe overhead. It fell in slow motion, catching the yellow light of the bulkhead lamp. A diamond in the rough. It landed on the hot casing of the cylinder head and vanished with a hiss that I couldn't hear over the engine's roar, but I felt it. A tiny extinction. Then the world ended. Not with a bang, but with a shriek. The klaxon tore through the humid air, a jagged, rhythmic electronic scream that bypassed the ears and went straight to the spine. The light shifted instantly from the sickly yellow to a bloody, hellish red. Action stations. The transition was physical, a jolt of adrenaline that soured the stomach. Dive, dive, the captain's voice crackled over the tan, stripped of its calm, tight with urgency. Enemy destroyer spotted, bearing 090. Clear the bridge. Vents open, the deck tilted. The floor dropped out from under us. My stomach lurched into my throat. The roar of the diesels cut out, strangled into silence as the electric motors took over, a sudden, terrifying drop in volume that left your ears ringing. We were falling. The only sound now was the rush of water flooding the ballast tanks, a violent gargle like a giant clearing its throat. And then, the sound that freezes the blood of every man who has ever served beneath the waves. It came from outside, penetrating the steel hull as if it were paper. A high-pitched metallic strike, a hammer hitting an anvil in a vast, empty room. Active sonar. They had found us. Rubis, ting. Ting, crack shattering the tension. The boat shuddered violently, whipped like a dog shaking a rat. A shower of sparks exploded from the main switchboard, illuminating the terror on Henry's face in a strobe light flash of blue and white. The smell of ozone and burning bakelite instantly filled the air, sharp and chemical, overpowering the diesel stink. Damage report. Stern tubes, the captain's voice on the intercom was shouting now, fighting the ringing in our ears. I grabbed the handset to respond, my hands slipping on the sweat-slicked plastic. Engine room, we have fire on the main board. We're losing power to the port screw. I waited for a response. Static, just the hiss of white noise. The line was dead. I looked up at the ceiling plates as the rivets screamed under the pressure. The sonar pings were a continuous tone now, a rapid-fire assault. The hunter was right above us, and he knew we were hurt. We were sinking, drifting down into the crushing dark, and the only sound left was the terrifying acceleration of the pings. The static on the line was the only answer I got. We were deaf, we were blind, and we were sinking. The captain knew the destroyer was circling back for the kill shot. He did the only thing a madman or a hero would do. He ordered us down, past the red line, past the manufacturer's warnings, past the point where steel behaves like steel and starts behaving like putty. The deck tilted sharply. Gravity became an enemy. I had to brace my boots against the main diesel block just to stay upright. The hull ribs were singing now, a high-pitched vibration that rattled your teeth. We were descending into the basement of the world. 200 meters. 220. The pressure hull was contracting. You could hear the rivets popping like knuckles in a quiet room. The air grew heavy, thick with the heat of the engines and the cold sweat of 50 men. Then the boat convulsed, not from a depth charge. This was internal, a violent shudder that knocked the wind out of me. A pipe in the forward torpedo compartment had burst. The high-pressure seawater line. It wasn't a leak. It was an execution. I didn't wait for the alarm. I knew that sound. It was the sound of the ocean breaking in. I grabbed the heavy iron monkey wrench from the bulkhead clips. I snatched a sheet of lead gasket material from the workbench. I didn't think. I moved. The factory worker in me. The man who waited for the foreman's nod. He died right there. I scrambled forward. The corridor was a nightmare. Men were shouting, sliding on the oily deck plates. I shoved past them. I hit the watertight door to the forward compartment. I spun the wheel and threw it open. It hit me like a physical blow. The water was a solid jet, slamming against the torpedo racks with enough force to strip paint. It was freezing, instantly numbing. The spray filled the air, a blinding mist of salt and oil. The water was already swirling around my calves. Black and angry, I waded in. The cold seized my legs, cramping the muscles instantly. I had to get to the secondary isolation valve. It was behind the spray, behind the violence. I pushed forward. The water rose to my thighs, then my waist. The boat lurched nose down. I slipped, my face going under the oily brine. I gagged, spitting out the taste of diesel and fear, and clawed my way back up. I reached the valve wheel. It was slick with grease. The water hammered against my chest, trying to push me back. I slotted the wrench. I jammed the lead sheet over the rupture. I heaved. Nothing. The pressure was immense. The Atlantic Ocean was holding the door open, and I was trying to shut it. Then the emergency lighting failed. Total darkness. I was blind, buried alive in a steel coffin at the bottom of the sea. The water roared in my ears, a deafening waterfall in the dark. I was freezing. I was alone. My hands were slipping. The wrench was sliding. The water was rising past my chest. It would be so easy to let go, to just let the cold take me, to stop fighting the machine. No, I am not a cog. I am the engine. I screamed into the darkness, a sound that no one heard over the rushing water. I locked my legs around the pipe. I put every ounce of hatred, every ounce of frustration from a lifetime of following orders into my arms. I pulled. The metal shrieked. A quarter turn. I pulled again. My tendons felt like they were snapping. Half a turn. The roar of the water changed. It went from a scream to a hiss. I didn't stop. I spun the wheel, gasping for air, fighting the numbness in my fingers. The jet sputtered. The violence drained out of the room. Silent, heavy, dripping silence. I slumped against the torpedo rack, shaking uncontrollably in the dark. I could hear my own heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I heard footsteps splashing in the corridor. Beams of flashlights cut the blackness. Voices, they were pumping the water out. We were rising. We made it back to Scotland 3 days later. We didn't celebrate. We didn't sing. We docked in the rain, a battered, rusting tube of steel that smelled of death and unwashed bodies. I walked off the gangplank, and my legs felt heavy on the solid ground. They gave me a medal. They told me I was a hero. I took it. I pinned it on my tunic. But I didn't feel like a hero. I felt like a ghost. I went back to work after the war. I went back to the factory in Nantes. I stood at my lathe. I watched the metal turn. I smelled the oil, but it wasn't the same. The precision was gone. I look at a machine now, and I don't see the gears working together. I see the failure points. I see where it will break. I hear the metal crying. I cannot fix a leaking faucet in my kitchen. The sound of water hissing under pressure. It paralyzes me. I stand there, gripping the sink, and suddenly the kitchen is dark, and the water is freezing, and I am drowning in the forward compartment of the Rubis. The factory taught me that if you follow the blueprints, the machine works. If you do your job, the harvest comes in. That is a lie. The blueprints don't account for the chaos. They don't account for the dark. In the factory, you build the machine. You follow the plans. But in the deep, when the machine that gives you life tries to kill you, you cannot follow plans. You must become the machine. You must feel where it will break. We were not just sailors. We were part of the steel. The true victory was not sinking the enemy. It was returning with your brothers. That is the honor. Remember that. This memory is a shard of glass I carry. Help me pull it out. Subscribe to keep this history alive.